afternoon and Happy New Year. I'm Courtney Bailey with Leadership Austin.
And I'm Trenzio Turner with Austin PBS. Thank you for joining us for today's engaged topic on normalizing mental health and grief in the workplace.
Now, Trenzio, wouldn't you say that the past 2 years have sent us into such a tailspin of emotions?
I agree 100%, and we're still in it, my friend, which is why we're here today.
So now you'll be interested to know that Mindshare Partners recently released a report on the state of mental health in the workplace in 2021. This report says that 76% of employees reported experiencing at least one symptom of a mental health condition in the past year, that being 56% burnout, 46% depression, and 40% anxiety. 84% of employees reported at least one workplace factor that negatively impacted their mental health, and 50% of full-time employees reported leaving a previous role due to mental health issues and challenges with company culture. This number rises to 81% for Gen Zers and 68% for millennials. And it's also important to note that Black, Latinx, and LGBTQIA plus employees are disproportionately represented in these numbers as well.
This report also says that 54% of all respondents listed mental health as a diversity, equity, and inclusion issue. On average, employers reported working at 72% of their full capacity within the past year when considering their mental health. Also, absenteeism is on the rise. Employees reported missing an average of 8 days of work due to mental health related issues.
So now we know that various factors play into workplace dynamics, but during this panel, we'll explore how much of this is influenced by employees' desire for better mental health and wellness. So as a result, we've invited 3 esteemed panelists to share their viewpoints on this topic.
First, joining us is Dr. Nikki Adeleke. Nikki is the Clinical Implementation Specialist for the Trauma and Grief Center at the Hackett Center for Mental Health.
And next we have Dr. Art Markman. Art is the co-host of Two Guys on Your Head podcast at KUT Radio, and he's also a cognitive scientist at the University of Texas at Austin.
And rounding us out, we have Karen Reynes. Karen is the Director of Workplace Programming at NAMI Central Texas. NAMI stands for National Alliance for Mental Illness. Welcome, and thank you all for being a part of today's panel.
All right, so let's get into our first question. Now, how would you describe the current state of mental health in our society, especially given the COVID-19 pandemic? And I'm going to kick it off to you, Art.
So this has been a tough year. I mean, I think, I think we are just low on resilience. All of us have to deal with stressors in our lives. Could be things that are happening at home. It could be things that are happening in the workplace. And one of the difficulties is when you deal with repeated stressors like we have been, whether it's issues at work, whether it's dealing with illness in the family, whether it's trying to navigate your kids' schooling, all of these things add up. And when you don't get a break from it, it becomes harder to recover from even the smallest of the problems that come up. And so I think people are just really living right at their edge right now.
Mm-hmm. I like that you mentioned recovery. I think we talk a lot about resilience, but we actually need to start exploring what does recovery look like for us. Karen, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the only thing that I'll add to that is I love the language that Adam Grant gave us this last year when he did that New York Times editorial, and he talked about this language around languishing, which I thought is such a great word, right? It's in this place where you're sort of stuck in the middle. You're not really super depressed, but you're not really flourishing. And I think that's where a lot of folks are. And it's no wonder. We have been on this pandemic roller coaster and we don't know. I often say I'm on the roller coaster backwards, that's going backwards, because I don't even know when the next dip dip is coming. So I do think that it has created this heightened anxiety, a sense of grief. I'm still grieving the loss of things that I've been missing out on. But I will say, I think there's something positive in this, and it's this, is that we are seeing more and more conversations around mental health, and certainly when we talk about workplace. And I think that is something to be celebrated. If there is any silver lining, it is that the mental health conversation has been elevated. And this panel today is a great example of that.
Thank you, Karen. Nikki?
Oh, yes. I mean, Art and Karen have definitely spoken so um, beautifully about what is currently happening in our society today. I think we're seeing a lot of people experiencing traumatic stress reactions. I would say the COVID-19 pandemic is um, an abnormal event that has continued for going on year 3 now. So it's the traumatic stress reactions that we're observing in people, and that maybe some of us are experiencing ourselves. It's very normal. And I think having these conversations help to normalize that and help to instill hope for a better tomorrow.
We'll get to talk more about those traumatic stress reactions later. So thank you for mentioning that.
Indeed. So the term workplace has expanded over the past 2 years. It used to mean a physical office or building where you went into work each day. And these spaces still exist. They're not extinct or anything like that. But they could also be a bedroom, your car, a bike, or all stops in between. How do today's companies create a healthy workplace environment when the definition of workplace is constantly changing and evolving? And Karen, we'd love for you to kick us off with this one.
Yeah, I think that this is really a place where companies need to really be listening to their employees. I think so often what happens is workplaces tend to address this from a place of, here's what we think is the right approach to this. And I think it's really important that companies and leaders and supervisors really put their listening on and pay attention to what it is that employees are telling them that they're looking for. How do they want to connect? And I think technology, obviously utilizing that the best we can. And then also looking for opportunities to provide support in lots of different kinds of ways. I think it's a time when we have to get really innovative and creative in terms of how we're doing that. I know we've been using a lot of digital tools for our office now to celebrate birthdays and other events that we would have done in person if we were still there. So it's looking for opportunities to keep people connected, but really engaging employees in that experience and helping them to lead that.
I love that you mentioned listening. It's amazing how when we do some active listening, the good stuff that can come from it. All right, let's go to Nikki.
Yeah, I think definitely, sometimes when you think about, the normal structure of a workplace, you're thinking, okay, we have managers, we have directors, and we kind of depend on them to come up with ideas to keep people engaged and connected and to feel valued. But I think what's most important and what is also important and what we're seeing now is that, we are allowing people who may not be in those managerial positions to share how they feel, to share the ideas and the ways where they would want to feel celebrated and included and valued. And, just listening to that and implementing that so that this idea of the workplace changes, but it's also in a way that with the changes, people feel included, and it just creates a more inclusive and supportive environment.
Absolutely. Thank you. Art?
Well, Karen and Nikki have had some great points, and I'll just add 2 more. The first is that we are now in an environment in which a lot of people are blending their living space with their workspace in a way that often didn't happen before. And it can be very difficult to get away from work at the end of the day. And it can be very difficult to get away from home care responsibilities while you're in the workplace. And so it all blends together. And I think creating some of those separations is really important, and giving an opportunity also to get away from work. And I think leaders need to model that behavior a little bit. So setting their emails so that it doesn't send out until 8 o'clock in the morning, so that even if you happen to be working late, you're not showing everybody else that they should be doing the same. I think that's one thing that needs to be done, is to really help people to create that separation. I think the other thing that we need to do in this environment in which so many people are working remotely is to be much more explicit about checking in with people about how they're doing. When you're in the workplace together, you can see if somebody's slumping over, if they're looking frustrated or sad. And it's much harder to see that when you're not really engaging with people that often. And when you are engaging with them, it's on a Zoom screen in which everybody's just a little square. So actually taking the time to actually check in explicitly to say, hey, how you doing? How are things going? Is there anything you need? Is there anything I can do to help? Is much more important now than it was when we were all working in the same place.
I agree that check-in has a whole new meaning today.
Right. We do have a question or comments from Angie Yao, and it's for you, Karen. Angie asks, can you provide examples or elaborate on the ways that you celebrated birthdays, etc., virtually?
Yeah, so we used to gather in the conference room, right, where we had whoever that person was, the birthday, we'd have their favorite treat, and we'd have a card that everyone signed. So we just shifted those same rituals, and so now we use a digital card that everyone signs and gets to put their wishes on, and then we usually have some sort of treat delivered to them, and then we set up a Zoom. So we've created the same sort of experience, but just different in that we're utilizing the virtual tools. But I think the important thing is that we're taking the time to recognize the same kinds of things we used to recognize pre-pandemic. And that came really from the staff, really saying, we like this idea of doing it this way. And so that goes back to that listening that I was talking about, and then just getting creative around rituals. And I think that's important. It's who we are as a company, it really is about the rituals we've created. And some of those translate to virtual really well, and some don't. So it really takes some creativity in figuring out how do we move forward in creating new rituals in this time when things are changing so much.
I like that, creating new rituals. Mm-hmm. That's good. So Nikki, I'm going to kick this next question to you. Mm-hmm. So earlier we mentioned trauma and stress, right? Trauma, bereavement, and grief are common terms that we hear when talking about mental health in the workplace. But can you give us a clinical definition of each of those terms, and then tell us the long-term psychological effects?
Sure, absolutely. So when we think about trauma, we define it as the experience of a real or perceived threat to the life or bodily integrity, or to the life or bodily integrity of a loved one. And with trauma, it causes an overwhelming sense of terror, horror, helplessness, and or fear. And the word perceived is really important because trauma is very subjective. What is traumatic to one individual and may produce intense reactions may not be traumatic for another individual as well. So trauma is very personal. It's very personal. When we look at the term bereavement actually is another form of trauma, and that is the experience or deprivation or loss by death, whereas grief is the psychological or behavioral response that arises from bereavement. So we think of grief as those feelings, those reactions, emotional reactions, psychological reactions that an individual experiences when someone they love or care about died. And in terms of psychological impacts, long-term effects, it varies. It could be intense feelings of sadness, irritability, difficulty sleeping, relationship issues, avoidant coping issues, suicidal thoughts. I mean, it definitely varies for sure.
Thank you for that, Nikki. And we have questions coming into the chat. This is obviously an important topic, and without us saying much about asking people to put questions in, they're already doing it. So this is great. This question comes from Holly Pearson, and she says, outside of taking PTO, how can those experiencing anxiety or mental health challenges at work advocate for themselves without threatening their position? Anyone care to take that one on?
Well, I'll say a couple of things. I'm sure that the rest of the panelists have some things as well. I think one thing that's really important, even before you start experiencing serious symptoms of anything like anxiety, is to figure out who your allies are likely to be. It's important to know, is your supervisor someone who is going to be responsive to the things that you say? Is it someone from your HR department? But it's important to figure out, who do you think you can talk to, and to actually have those kinds of conversations, because often we worry more about other people's reactions than, and so we choose not to say things, we edit ourselves, when in fact, almost anyone we talk to is likely to be an advocate for us and is likely to give us some strategies that we can use to help us to deal with symptoms of any mental illness, including anxiety. And so I think it's important to figure out who you feel like you can speak to, but to be willing to speak up for yourself.
All right. Oh, yes, go ahead, Nikki, please.
And I just want to add to that as well, if that's okay. I know that a big buzzword that we hear is self-care, self-care, self-care. And sometimes it's like, oh, self-care Sundays, right? Which presents this idea that self-care is limited to a 2-day weekend or 1 day of the week. But really thinking about, changing the way we think about self-care, looking at it in terms of what are things that you can do for yourself daily to feel good, to feel connected to yourself, to feel connected to others, to feel connected to what you value the most, to what brings you joy, to what brings you happiness. And for those of us who are working in the professions, helping others, the cost of caring tends to be heavy. And so looking at self-care in terms of, our individual ability to engage in helping others without sacrificing the most important parts of our own individual lives.
I love that. And I would like to add to that self-care isn't always sexy. Self-care is like setting boundaries, it's saying no. And that can be uncomfortable, but that is a part of self-care, and we kind of like forget that. Yeah. We have a question from Cynthia Martinez. Cynthia asks, how can we help change what some workplaces deem as acceptable trauma or grief? For example, some workplaces might not recognize trauma and grief caused by the loss of a non-relative or pet. Anybody want to chime in on that? If not, Karen, I see you leaning in.
I was sort of waiting to see if Nikki was going to say anything in regards to that, but
really going go
this
ahead,
is her area. But I think this is that really challenging time when we, again, have to speak up. And I love what you mentioned, Courtney, about boundaries. I think in many respects, we are in a culture in which we don't recognize boundaries as something positive. That always sounds like something negative in our culture, right? But I think recognizing boundaries as positive, healthy things. And so I think it creates that opportunity for us to have conversations where we can be really honest and open about saying, hey, I recognize that in our traditional sense of what grief is, we may not recognize the loss of a non-relative or a pet or some other experience of grief as such. But I want to really propose that we consider exploring that, because I think it would be really beneficial at this time. And one of the things that we're recognizing is we are experiencing a lot of grief. Again, not just grief from loss of life, but loss of things as we knew them. Sometimes the small things now, I think Art sort of alluded to that. It's that compounding of things. So I think it's important to be able to be that voice that speaks up and requests that we sort of evaluate some of those policies that play a part in sort of that boundaries. Like, this is what I need to be effective and efficient and good at my work. Is this opportunity to take care of myself in this way? And that's not always easy.
It's not.
Yeah.
Nikki, we know that's your wheelhouse. You want to add anything?
Yeah, this is definitely an area that is requiring just a lot of policy attention in terms of, bereavement leave and who is considered an immediate family member or, and, you know, or an immediate relative. And I just want to bring up something that's really important. When certain workplaces or jobs, you know, use the term immediate relative, it really at times can minimize the important feelings and emotions and thoughts that one has towards a friend who they may have lost, or a pet that they may have lost, or even if they were separated from their family due to immigration reasons, or the loss or the death of a same sex partner. And so it really shouldn't be the it should be us, the people who are experiencing bereavement, who are experiencing grief, to be the one to say, hey, this is what happened. This is what this makes me feel incredibly sad. I need this time. So I think it's about, being able to, just like Karen was saying, vocalize how you feel, stand up for yourself. That does take a lot of courage, but also policies need to be changed so that people have enough time to be able to practice their own personal rituals, to be able to mourn, to be able to grieve. It's a really important issue.
Thank you for that. Redefining policies to make that happen. I like that. All right, you want to add anything, or you want us to go to the next?
I think Karen and Nikki really gave some great suggestions here, and I know we've got some other questions to get to, so I think I'll let it stand with that.
Thank you. Karen, so this question is for you. Individuals who display signs of mental health issues are sometimes viewed as weak, irresponsible, unproductive, and even harmful, right? And sadly, these stereotypes persist in all fields, including the mental health and healthcare fields. What can organizations and employers do to unlearn these stereotypes and incorporate proactive tools to improve employee wellness? And I know we touched on some, but can you give more detailed examples?
Yeah, and you covered a lot there. And so one of the things I want to go back to is some of the data that you shared at the beginning around how many people, the percentage of people that see mental health as a DEI issue. And I think that's critically important for organizations and companies to recognize, is that this is not just an HR issue, it is a DEI issue, because we know that there is this discrimination really that happens when we talk about people who live with mental health conditions in the workplace. Just the language that you use, that we would equate people who have a health issue and use those kinds of terms, but that is the culture. So that takes us back to where we really need to start looking at a cultural change within the workplace. And quite frankly, I think there's three things we've got to do. So one is starting with leadership. I think from the very top, leadership has to normalize mental health. They can really, and I know sometimes leadership is hesitant to make themselves vulnerable or transparent about this, but the reality is that when you look at the data, right, if 80% of us at some point in our life have had an experience of a mental health issue, that means all of us really have been acted, either ourselves or someone we love and care about. Leaders can really help drive that change by sharing their own story, by really being the ones that speak of the importance of people managing their mental health well. The second thing is really about education and awareness. We have to really educate people to understand these as the health issues that they are. And, bringing in organizations like ours to help do that is really helpful. And then the last place is support, which is really about making that investment in some of the robust benefits and support services that employees need. And I think often what is happening is employers are starting with the support services with benefits and things like employee assistance plans. And that's great, but those are vastly underutilized when it comes to mental health, because people still have a lot of shame and stigma. The studies show that about 60% of people will say, I've never talked about mental health at work because I've been fearful that I will lose my job, that people will see me differently. I'm just embarrassed or ashamed. We have to change the culture. And I think a leadership can be key in helping that and are instrumental to helping us change that.
Thank you for that, Karen.
All right, I want to talk to you a little bit about trust. for a moment. And I know you've written about it recently. With employees leaving at alarming rates and feeling like leaving is the only way to achieve a better work situation, what can employers do to earn and retain the trust needed to keep their staff happy and satisfied?
Yeah, this whole great resignation that we're seeing now is something that is a reflection of this accumulated difficulty with, as we talked about earlier, resilience, combined with this feeling that a lot of our employers don't necessarily have our backs. That, so I think there's several things that employers can do to really help with that. The first is to invest in their employees' futures, to really be having conversations about what is the career path that you'd like, what education might you need, what are the things that you might want for your life that the organization may be able to help you to achieve, so that you are partners in a career and not just a place to go to work. I think it's important for employers to think a lot about the income inequality that we're seeing. Obviously, not every employee in an organization is going to get paid the same amount, and we expect a certain amount of that. We certainly expect that people with more experience, who've had more success, may get paid more money. But when the people at the top of the organization are being paid several multiples more than other folks in the organization, it really undermines that sense that you're in the work for a sense of common mission, and that can undermine people's trust as well. And then one last thing that I think is important, which is organizations tend to think, well, one way that I can try and create trust is by asking people about what they need, what they're feeling. And the problem with asking those questions is that if there's no follow through from that, then research by one of my colleagues, Ethan Burris here at UT, suggests that asking those questions actually backfires if you don't demonstrate that you've heard what people are saying, that you care about what they're saying, and that you're going to do something about it. So it's important for organizations to really close that loop and actually act on the kinds of information that they get from people.
That's great. So partnership, income equality, and then make sure you follow through. Don't just leave it hanging after they basically pour their heart out to you, going through all those steps with them.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Thank you, Art. We want to also pull another question in from the comment section, and this is from Lulu Davis. It says, if we want to create a support group in the workplace to help increase education and awareness of mental wellness, loss, and grief, what are some things we should consider when creating this group? Right? It's great that they want to do this. Anyone want to take it on?
I can start. I think one important aspect to consider is diversity, creating a group with diverse individuals, people of color, white people, people who are part of the LGBTQI plus community, just people who have different ideas, different values, different things that they can contribute to the group, and not necessarily having one person with very linear ideas, take the lead or take charge.
One of the
Absolutely.
things,
Go ahead, Karen.
yeah, I think one of the things that I'd add to that I think is really interesting is in a lot of companies, you're really seeing this groundswell growth of employee resource groups. And to me, they are just such wonderful opportunities to have this grassroots approach to what is it that employees value, it's important to them. And many of them aim exactly for that. Like the best of employee resource groups are intentionally diverse in their approach. And so one of the things that we're really seeing is a lot of employee resource groups that are then enveloping mental health as part of what they're looking at. Because again, going back to that intersectionality that we know is happening. So seeing an employee resource group that's focused around LGBTQIA plus, and then bringing in the mental health component because we know that it exists. And the same thing with a ERG that's focused on Black employees or brown employees, and that all of them are really, again, very diverse and have an opportunity to bring in this element because we know that it impacts, again, culturally as well. So I love that approach, and that seems to be working really well at a lot of companies. The only other thing that I would add to that is that make sure that, again, you're supporting yourself with information. There's an opportunity to partner with organizations like ours or a counseling center or someone. Make sure that you're getting the kind of solid information and education that ensures that you are also sharing the right information with people, and make sure that resources are a big part of that as well.
And I just want to add one more piece to this that builds on what Karen was just saying, which is it's not just information that you want to make sure you're connected to. You actually want to make sure you're connected to mental health resources. One of the things that can happen when you form a group is that someone may actually come forward who is in crisis at that moment. And if you're not a trained clinician, you don't want to be dealing with that. You're not that, we wouldn't, if someone was having a physical illness, we wouldn't expect anyone to just go treat them. And the same thing is true with mental wellness. If someone's in crisis, we need to have resources where we can refer people right away. And so make sure that when you form that group, you are connected with someone who might be willing to take someone on to help them to deal with a significant issue that comes up when you're having conversations.
I have a follow-up really quick before I go to our next question. Karen, you mentioned employee resource groups. Can you help me understand, and maybe some other folks watching may have the same question that I have, is this a group that's formed by the employees? And if so, does it take into account that sometimes the employees most impacted by the issue, they may don't have that capacity to form this group or to create that, to create those resources, and that may be adding to their mental health issue?
Yeah, absolutely. Like in the best of situations where you're seeing employee resource groups form, they have a lot of support from the company and the organization and their human resource department as well. So that there's a lot of support there for them in forming the groups and in making sure that they have all the resources and support that they need. So I will say that most of the places where you're seeing ERGs forming are larger companies that have the resources to support that. Because to your point, you don't want to create a situation in which you've just added more, responsibility and, more onus on folks that are already overwhelmed. So great point that you've made there.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I want to go back to our to burnout. Earlier, I shared a data point about employees experiencing burnout. So I have two parts to this question. First, could one of you share what is burnout, and do you think that it's only happening in the workplace? And second, how might it show up for different types of employees? For example, the caregiver, the remote worker, the parent, the full-time employee, part-time employee, and even employees of color. And so I'll kick it to you, Nikki, first. You look like you want to
Oh, really? Well, I work in a very in a very different setting. I'm a clinician, and so I, of course, implement trauma and grief assessment and intervention. But what I have observed with colleagues and with essential workers is the experience of secondary trauma or vicarious trauma. And that experience in itself is often followed by experiencing burnout at work. And so the idea of loving what you do, loving the atmosphere and the environment and helping people, but that cost of caring being very, very heavy. And then those individuals also experiencing traumatic stress, secondary traumatic symptoms as a result of providing care for others as well. Um, I don't know if anyone wants
I'll,
wants to jump in, Karen
I'll,
or
I'll
Art.
add something to that. I mean, I think from my experience and the work we've been doing in workplace, we talk a lot about the realness of burnout, because I think recognizing like it's a real syndrome, and that we recognize that chronic stress is often what fuels burnout. So it is no wonder that we're seeing, part of that mass resignation is so many people experiencing that burnout. And I think, to Nikki's point, do we see even heightened amounts of it in situations in which people are essential workers, or they're in situations where they're constantly, their empathy and compassion is constantly being tapped into? Absolutely. But I think those of us who are not in those places also are experiencing that, because we have just been bombarded with constant chronic stress that comes from just the not even knowing what's coming next. So I think whether that's parents or caregivers or anyone, like all of us have been having to tap into that empathy and compassion, and we just get worn out. And I think going back to what you talked about as far as the self-care and why that's so important, and that it's not just the feel good, oh, take a bubble bath, that it is about setting boundaries and knowing when to say no, and knowing when to say, I need to stop and make myself a priority, and how important that is, because we are all at risk of that burnout piece. And if we're not proactive about taking care of ourselves, we're just not going to be able to navigate it well, and we will crash and burn at some point. We will.
And just to be clear, I mean, to think about what burnout is. I mean, burnout is a persistent state. It's not, everyone has bad days at work, even a bad couple of days. This is really something that is persistent over a week, several weeks of, and many of the symptoms of burnout are the same kinds of symptoms you see with depression. So it's not just sadness. It's not feeling that passion, not feeling that interest, increased irritability, increased anxiety, a real desire to avoid the workplace and to avoid the work that you're doing, an inability to have good interactions with your colleagues anymore. And even a desire not to see those colleagues. All of those are symptoms of burnout. And when they're happening over a period of time, or when you see them happening with someone else over a period of time, that is that time to try not just to engage in self-care, but actually to reach out and to try to get some help from somebody else. I mean, these are, it is hard to just try to power through this. And I think we have a culture where many people feel like, I've just got to find a way to get through this myself. We have to treat all of these issues, all mental health issues, as health issues. And just as we're not going to allow ourselves to try to get over a disease like cancer without some kind of treatment, we have to be willing to engage with mental health professionals to help us through these difficult times.
I love that you said that. Go ahead, Karen. They both your hands. Go ahead.
I just want to put an exclamation point to what Art just said. This notion of understanding mental health as a health issue, I think is critical for all of us, because even the language in the question that you asked me previously, right? Like, we tend to think of mental health as this failure. Somehow I failed. I'm not strong enough. I'm not, I'm not, doing the right things. I have failed. And we would never think that if we develop diabetes, or if we develop cancer, or any other health issue. And so we've got to change that way of thinking around mental health. And I think it allows us then to recognize when it is, to Art's point, when we need help for ourselves. Because I am not going to treat myself for diabetes if I recognize the signs there. I'm going to go see my doctor and say, hey, we have to partner together to figure out how I can be the best and healthiest version of myself. And mental health should be no different. So thank you for saying that, Art. I just want to put an exclamation point on that.
I like that. Nikki, I saw your hand go up too.
Yeah. Definitely, piggybacking off of what Art and Karen have shared, and also thinking in terms of, mental health issues and disparities among people of color, and people of color who uniquely may have their own mental health challenges, anxiety, depression, but then also may turn on the TV, watch the news, and see another fellow person from their community being unjustly killed or murdered or sentenced. Um, and the weight of that grief, and I think it becomes even more burdensome if you identify as a member of that community and then you go to work and no one talks about it.
Yep.
No one brings it up. It's as if some people are intentionally ignoring what is happening or what has happened or what has occurred. And I think that as well exacerbates the feelings of burnout. Well, do I even matter now at my workplace? Do are my feelings what I think, are they important? So I think that definitely can exacerbate mental health symptoms, depression, anxiety, PTSD symptoms as well. It's a real issue. It's an important issue.
And I just, Nikki, I think that's so important because community matters a lot in mental health. We need to feel like we're part of a group, part of a community, of a neighborhood. And I think, organizations function best when they act like a neighborhood, when they act in a way where people feel like they have the trust and support of the people around them. And I think, when an event happens, if you think about the murder of George Floyd that happened, so right early on in the COVID pandemic, if to the extent that an organization says, well, this is an issue that only the Black community needs to deal with, it's not all of our issue, then what it says is we're not a community, we're several different communities, and because of that, I think you actually then do exacerbate the mental health problems, the burnout problems, because you're not saying we're all in this together. You're saying, sub communities are supposed to go off by themselves. And I think what we have to do is to embrace the entire community and see what we can do to ensure that all of us are working together to create, to uphold each other in stressful times.
Absolutely. I definitely had a very similar experience at a former place of employment where I'm no longer, working there or connected to. But I agree with you, Art. To say that, okay, all the people of color get together or all the Black people get together and y'all go talk about it. Y'all have a huddle. Y'all figure it out. It's extremely marginalizing, and it sends the message that other people, such as white people or people who are Asian, or it sends the message that they shouldn't care or they shouldn't be distressed about it, and that's just not true. Overall, it should be a collective, shared effort to address disparities.
And to be clear, with mental health, because when we talk about like George Floyd, or it becomes like political, right? Mental health doesn't have to be political. You can maybe not agree or maybe have different political views, but still ask your colleague, how are you doing? Hey, I know this might be tough. And that, like the human part of that, like where is that, right?
Yeah. I think I just wanted to add to that, in listening to both Art and Nikki talk, and especially this notion that Art brought up around this sense of community. I think one of the things that employers have to recognize and employees have to speak up for when they're able to is that we're no longer in that space anymore. The pandemic has transformed us. And so to your point about, I'm sitting in my bedroom working today, right? Like, one of the things that has happened is that we have had this opportunity to understand that we have to start approaching work as one part of what we do, and taking a more holistic approach to employees in the workplace, and understanding that the things that they experience, whether it's because of incidences like we talked about with George Floyd, or it's my kids are home and I'm having to do, remote learning with them because now school has been delayed 2 weeks, or whatever it is, I've lost my pet or whatever, that we are our best versions of ourselves in the workplace when we have been recognized as whole people and not just workers. And I think there's something powerful that has happened in the midst of the pandemic that has helped us to see that. And I think that's why you're having so many people saying, you know what, this is important to me. And so in my next job, right, Nikki? Like,
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
going to work someplace that values this part of who I am as a human. And again, I would not have wished the pandemic on us, but I think one of the things that we can walk away from this is this understanding that there are some opportunities to really use as a springboard the experience of this pandemic to really transform how we work and live in the future. And I think that's exciting, daunting, but exciting.
Something to take on. I'm curious. I love also the aspect of community, and it's all of us. Speaking of that, we know employees aren't the only ones who have to deal with mental health. Employers and bosses have to be mindful of their mental health as well. What advice would you have for those supervisors and leaders who fear, transparency, but may need help, may need support also?
I will say, I think that leaders need to have the people that they feel that they can talk to. And, the higher up you go in an organization, the fewer people that you may feel like you can have as trusted advisors within the organization. And that's where I think there's an interesting lesson that leaders can take from clinical psychologists, clinicians. Most clinicians have other people that they can engage with as a professional community to talk to about difficult cases, to talk about their own emotional reactions when they're dealing with those difficult cases. And I think that leaders need the same thing. Leaders need other people who are who might be coaches for them, or they might be peers that they can work with, so that they feel like they can actually have the kinds of conversations that help to talk about the other mental health symptoms that they may be dealing with, where they feel that they're in a safe environment to do that. And so seeking out those people before you need them is a really important thing to do.
That's great advice. Doing it before, and it's kind of the part of the conversation you were having earlier. Let's talk to employees before we get to this situation, so we can try to help them have the clinical support for them also. We have a question in the comments section, and this is from Cordella Blanchard. Do you believe our cultural shifts towards living your passion has driven increased levels of burnout, as there's more pressure for work to be perfect all the time? And if so, how do we manage wanting the best work for ourselves while remembering that no job will be perfect, excluding toxic workplaces, of course?
I will say I hate the phrase "live your passion." I did a book a couple of years ago called "Bring Your Brain to Work," and one of the first things I do is to say that phrase drives me crazy. We actually have to recognize that what you want is work that you do that you feel is part of something bigger than yourself. But passion is something that develops because you're in an environment in which you are working towards something you think is important, that you are working with people who you think are part of your community, and in which you are given some amount of opportunity to influence the kinds of work that are being done. And I think when you have those elements, the passion develops from that. And you have to understand that doing anything important involves some days that are wonderful and some days that are frustrating, and that frustration is part of the process. And I think that by focusing people on how they feel about their work rather than their engagement with the process of doing work, I think we do create a sense in which people are dissatisfied when they come home on a particular day and think, well, I didn't like that. Well, okay, you didn't like that, but did you feel like doing that actually contributed to something important, even if you didn't like that particular task? And if so, you can still feel tremendous pride in that, even when you had to do something that wasn't necessarily the thing that you love to do on a day-to-day basis.
I love that.
Yeah.
We go into our call to action. I want to put Nikki and Karen on the spot really quick. I want to go back to that employer question, right? Because Art mentioned employers finding their peers, but we talked about trust, right? And if we trust, we want our employees to share what's going on with them, then how can employers start to be vulnerable and also communicate some things too in a way where it doesn't jeopardize the employee-employer relationship, but it does create more transparency and level sets.
Yeah. Well, you know that I had already mentioned that. So that I really think that it's important that leaders take the opportunity to be transparent and vulnerable when they are comfortable doing so. And I think it's necessary for them to have the support that they need in that. And I think it's critical to understand that when we are vulnerable in work settings, it doesn't mean that we have to give all the details of our experiences, that there is power in a leader simply saying, hey, I completely understand because I've been there. This has been a difficult time for me as well. I've been navigating some pretty serious things myself. You know, those kinds of things, like you don't have to tell the whole story. You only have to tell what you're comfortable with. But I have seen in workplaces where leadership has done that and how it truly has transformed the organization and created opportunities for that trust to be built. Because it's like, okay, if leadership has been able to say that, and I think when you couple that with the right education and training for supervisors, because I will say that can also be sticky, that if you've got supervisors who don't have the kinds of training to know how to respond to those situations, you may actually have something counterproductive. But once again, creating that space for everyone to get the support that they need and for everyone to understand that mental health is health and normalizing that, how powerful that can be for an organization and for every person that is a part of that organization.
Yeah,
That's great. I love the mention of vulnerability. It's not this big scary thing, right? We shouldn't be afraid of it. So much great information. It's time for us to jump into our. Oh, Nikki, did I cut you off?
No, it's okay. It's okay. I know we have a limited amount of time. I wanted to add another point, but that's okay.
All right. Well, I'm actually gonna go to you first with our call to action, so that way you can kind of work that in there. And it's gonna be a two-part call to action. The first part is, what is the first step that organizations can take to advance mental wellness in the workplace? And Nikki, let's start off with you on that one, and feel free to work in anything else you have.
Well, I think one of the first steps is to actually live out the vision, the mission, the values that the organizations or workplaces have set. I think a lot of times, there are these missions and these values, and it's emailed to you, it's added to your signature, but it's not really shown. And I think one of the very first steps to show that is to just show that you care, to show that human experiences, human interactions matter to you, that people do matter, that people are important, that you really care about them as a whole person, as Karen mentioned earlier, and to create these situations where we're not just talking about your deliverables or your deadlines, but like, how are you doing? And when a person is having a rough day or a rough time or experiencing trauma or grief, to not ask the question, what's wrong with you, but to ask what happened or what happened to you. And opening up those conversations just allow more connectiveness. It helps people to feel important, to feel valued, and to feel supported.
Okay. Thank you, Nikki. And then let's go in quickly to Art and then Karen.
Yeah, really quickly, I would just say, I think it's really important for leadership and organizations to lead with empathy, to really just be, to be asking questions, to really listen to the answers that people are giving, and to help people to speak about the things that they're feeling right now.
Thank you, Art. Karen?
And I would land it on education and training. I think going back to that notion of helping everyone to understand that mental health is health, familiarizing them with what the resources are, and giving them the tools to be able to have positive and proactive mental health conversations is incredibly critical to really advancing mental wellness in the workplace.
And real quickly, as a follow up, is there one thing that those people watching right now could do immediately after they log out to start that process? Anybody can take that.
I would like to share an important resource. So at the Lucene Center, so the Lucene Center provides telehealth to children and teens who have experienced trauma and loss. We have a virtual learning library that is supported by the New York Life Foundation. And this virtual learning library is a great resource that you can just learn, receive a lot of education, a lot of training, get a lot of your answers, questions, and ways to support your staff, employees, children, families, and even yourselves as individuals.
Thank you.
So concretely, I would say, if you haven't done it already, reach out to a colleague and just ask them how they're doing, and find those mental health buddies that you can have in the workplace. If you make sure that you've got the people that you can talk to, both when times are good and when they're not so good.
Yeah. I was going to say something similar. It's like going beyond the asking, how are you, but asking, how are you really? And taking that time to really listen and see what the answer is. And then I would follow that up with, again, becoming familiar with the resources, NAMI Central, TX.org. We have all kinds of resources and opportunities for education and training, and we'd love to help you with that.
Awesome. Thank y'all for that.
Yeah, so much great absolutely, so much great information. Thank you, Dr. Nikki Adeleke, Dr. Art Markman, Mrs. Karen Reynes, for sharing your diverse perspectives and for reminding us to prioritize mental wellness in our workplace.
And so we also thank those watching. We hope that you can join us next month, where the topic will be anti-racism training in the workplace. And so we'll see you then, and enjoy the rest of your day.